Hey, welcome to American Government Week 1. This is where we're actually going to get into content. Let's go! So up to this point in your social studies career, you've probably heard your social studies teachers tell you the reason why the state forces you to take all these classes to graduate is so that we have a well-informed population that will prevent people like this from taking power. And that might be true, combined with a little sense of patriotism. But the emphasis on this class, like I said last week, is not so much to look back at the past, but it's to look at the current system of government, and it's to show you how to participate and also kind of share with you what rights you have. Not to mention that it's also kind of important to be able to look at the news and understand what's going on. Before I make the case for you about why taking a government class is worth your time, I should probably define what government even is to begin with. Government is the institution through which a society makes and enforces its public policies. Government is made up of those people who exercise its powers, like making laws and regulations, and all those who have the authority to control people through threats of force. Now, every year I have students that tell me government is simply the institution that makes rules. But think about that for a second. Don't your parents make rules for you? What's the difference then between a teacher that might make rules, or your parents that might make rules, or your employer that might make rules? Are they technically government? No, they're not. The big difference is that government uses threats of violence, and they can actually force people to do those things. Now you might be thinking, whoa, Mr. Lucas, you mean to tell me the difference between the rules that my parents, my employer, and my teachers make and what government does is that government can hold a gun to my head? Yes, that is what I'm telling you. See, that's the difference between a rule and a law. Government creates laws and then enforces them. In order for them to be able to enforce the law, they often have to use threats of violence. And yes, it can come down to them holding a gun to your head to get you to do something. Now, if that seems kind of crazy, well, keep in mind, we're not using the 4th grade definition of government anymore. Instead, we're showing you how it really is. Let me give you an example. Let's say you show up to work one too many times late, and your boss is done. Well, there's no law that says that you have to show up to work on time, but it might be your employer's policy that you show up to work on time. And if you violate that policy, your boss might fire you, and that's that. And let's say you are just having an awful day at school, and you pull out of here on a Price Road, and you start flying down the road because you want to get home. Then all of a sudden, you hear sirens behind you, and you see flashing lights. A police officer pulls you over and they give you a ticket. Well, oftentimes you'll have to go to traffic court, and at traffic court, they'll issue a fine or something you have to pay them. But let's say you don't really want to pay the fine, so you choose not to. Well, if you don't pay the fine, eventually they'll give you an even bigger fine you have to pay. What if you don't want to pay that one either? Well, if you don't want to pay that one either, eventually you're going to get a court summons to come back to court where they'll talk about jail time. But what if you say,
nah, I don't really feel like it?
Well, eventually police officers are going to come to your house and they're going to knock on your door and ask you to get in the cop car with them. And what if you say, yeah, still not feeling it today? Well, eventually the cops will have to use force. Eventually they'll have to use a threat of violence against you and say something like, if you don't get in the cop car, I'm going to have to arrest you. And then if you resist at all, eventually the police are going to have to use violence against you, whether that's the threat of a gun or them tackling you to the ground and dragging you to the cop car. I mean, can you imagine your teachers or your boss or even your parents doing all of that just because you broke a rule? I've looked into it. Believe me, I'm not allowed to do it. Apparently, there's a law against arresting kids that decide to fill your Kahoot games with thousands of bots. So to summarize all that, the difference between a private business or a private individual making a rule and government is that government makes laws. And with laws, they can use threats of violence or force against you to get you to do something or to follow the law. Now, why does government have to resort to threats of violence to get people to do things? Well, go back to my speeding example. If you sped down the road, the cop pulled you over and told you you had to pay a fine and you didn't really feel like doing it and there was nothing they could do to actually get you to pay that fine, well then essentially the speeding law becomes just a suggestion. If people don't follow it, well, nothing really happens to them. It can be argued that government has a monopoly on violence or a monopoly on force. For example, if you don't pay your taxes to the government, then the government will threaten to throw you in prison. But if I walked up to any of you and held a gun to your head and demanded you give me $20 or I'd lock you up, I'd be arrested, ironically, by the government. Whether you think this is wrong or right, that's how it is. Famous quote from a political scientist named Harry Brown. He said, "Government is force, pure and simple. There's no way to sugarcoat that. And because government is force, it will attract the worst elements of society. People who want to use government to avoid having to earn their living or to avoid having to persuade others to accept their ideas voluntarily." So one of the reasons it's a good idea to learn about government is so that you can participate politically to prevent people like that from getting in power. Because there are people internationally, nationally, at the state level, and at the local level who would love to use the threats of violence and force that are intrinsic in government to get people to do what they want. So even if that doesn't convince you and you're still thinking, gosh, I still don't really want to take this class, think of it this way. Who's forcing you to be in this class? Who's forcing you to take this class to graduate? It's the government. Wouldn't you like to know how to change things that you don't like? It's one of the great ironies I see every year. Students that tell me government doesn't matter and they hate the class, yet it's government that forces them to take the class. What I'm getting at is whether or not you like government doesn't matter. What does matter is that someday, at some point in time, there's going to be a policy you disagree with. It would be a good idea to know how to participate to actually make effective change. And in this class, I will do my best to make sure that what we're learning is actually what you'll need to know when you're an adult. So another term you'll need to know is public policy, which are all those things a government decides to do. It's going to include things like taxation, defense, education, crime, healthcare, transportation, the environment, working conditions, etc. Now, there are three kinds of governmental power. The first is called legislative power. This is the power to make law and to frame public policies. You can remember that simply by the fact that law starts with an L, and so does legislative power. Executive power is the second type of governmental power. This is the power to execute, enforce, and administer the law. If you look at that word enforce there, it starts with an E, so that should help you remember executive enforces the law, or they execute the law. Literally think about someone breaking the law being executed. The executive branch of government, they're the ones that actually punish people. They're the ones that are in charge of the police, the National Guard, and the military, who actually do use violence to get people to follow the law. The last type of power is judicial power, and this is where you usually think of a judge. This is the power to interpret laws, to determine their meaning, and to settle disputes that might arise within society. Sometimes with laws, their wording can be confusing, and you may need a judge to determine what it actually means. Sometimes people get angry with each other and they might sue one another in a civil case. And a lot of times the judicial branch will take a look at the civil case and decide who is right. Now, the powers of government are often outlined in a country's constitution. You're going to hear that term a lot this year. In fact, that will be the main focus of the first half of our class this year, is learning what powers our government has by looking at the Constitution. And a constitution is the body of fundamental laws setting out the principles, the structures, and the processes of a government. Now, it is worth wondering where governments come from. How did they pop into existence? Why is it that every nation has one? Well, there are four theories about how government came into existence. Let's go to the thinking sphere. The first theory is called force theory. That's the idea that basically a long time ago, there was a bigger person, and maybe they got along for a while, but eventually there was some sort of conflict. The bigger people got angry and decided to subjugate the little people. And that's how the first government was born, through threats of force. The next theory is called evolutionary theory. And when I say evolutionary theory, I don't mean like the scientific sense of evolution. Rather, instead, it's the idea that really humanity started with the family and populations continue to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. Eventually, those people formed little small communities where they had some form of governance, and then that grew into small villages, which then grew into cities and metropolises with much bigger governments. Then there's divine right theory, which is the idea that God or some sort of supreme being or beings selected someone because they won a battle or because they found a crown or a special sword. Then there's social contract theory, which is the idea that if you're born in a nation or you live in a nation that writes its own laws, actually looks at the pros and cons, and then decides to enforce those laws, you agree to abide by them just because you live there. And if you end up breaking one of those laws that was created by the government, you agree to the punishments that was set forth by the legislative power of government or by the judge, whether you like it or not. I know what you're thinking. Yes, I did steal the idea from Crash Course's thought bubble. Sue me. Wait, Maybe they actually could. Judicial power. Now, of these theories, social contract is the most popular. Again, the idea that you consented to a government just because you were born there. But not necessarily everyone agrees with the social contract theory. For example, Adam Smith, who you might remember from history class, famously said, "To say that by staying in a country a man agrees to a contract of obedience to government is just the same with carrying a man into a ship and after he is at a distance from land to tell him that by being in the ship he is contracted to obey the master." Thomas Jefferson also famously challenged the idea of the social contract theory when he said, "I am increasingly persuaded that the earth belongs exclusively to the living and that one generation has no more right to bind another to its laws and judgments than one independent nation has the right to command another." This is essentially asking the question, is it really fair that you all have to follow laws that were made by dead white guys from 200 years ago? I mean, you all weren't alive then. You didn't sign a paper saying that you agreed to follow all of these laws and that you agreed to the government we have. At least I don't think any of you were there at the ratification of the Constitution. So there's different theories out there about how government came into being, but there's also different theories about why government does exist. To some, it exists to promote the general welfare of everyone. To some, it exists simply to protect your private property. Often how a nation of people decide to answer that question determines the type of government they end up implementing. Broadly speaking, when it comes to actually classifying different types of governments, we usually group them into either a dictatorship or a democracy. Now, that's a very simplified way to classify them, but it actually goes a lot more in depth than that. There are different types of democracies. There are also different types of dictatorships. Let's take a look at the different types of democracies first. First of all, there's direct democracy, sometimes called pure democracy. That exists where the will of the people is translated into public policy directly by the people themselves in mass meetings. That means basically everyone gets together and everyone votes and the majority rules. Now, while that might sound nice, direct democracy is often linked to something called mob rule, where the tyranny of the majority rules the day. Well, let's say the majority of people vote to harm you or duct tape you to the ceiling. Well, in a direct democracy, that goes. There's nothing there to protect your individual rights. Then there's representative democracy, where essentially instead of everyone voting on it, they might select some people to represent them, and those representatives will then vote on a particular issue. So instead of the entire mob of people voting on something, it's a smaller group of people representing the mob itself, which means there's like a middleman where you vote for someone who then votes on your behalf. Another term for representative democracy is indirect democracy. And some people say the United States is a representative democracy because we have representatives, as we'll learn in class, and every election is essentially you, the masses, deciding if you agree with how that person voted and if they really truly were representative of you. Then there's a republic, which is a representative democracy that goes a step further. In fact, this is probably the best term for what the United States has. In a republic, there's a representative democracy. However, if the masses vote to violate the rights of an individual, in a republic, the law protects the rights of the individual, no matter what the masses might say. And as we'll learn in class later, we have something called the Bill of Rights that protects certain rights that you have that are given to you by your nature or given to you by God, however you want to look at it. In a republic, the government through the law protects those rights that you have from the tyranny of the majority. And in the United States, the example of this we have is the Bill of Rights, which protects things like your freedom of speech, your right to own a weapon from the mob or the tyranny of the majority. Again, that simply means that the majority of people can't vote to take away your house, your car, your property, or your right to speak freely. But you can also break down democracies even further and ask questions like, how is the law made? Who gets to enforce the law? Are they the same people? Is there one government in a centralized location that makes the laws for the entire country? Or are there various governments under one government that help delegate those tasks? Sometimes governments can be classified by where power is distributed geographically throughout a nation. If there's multiple governments within a nation that do different things, oftentimes that's classified as a federal government, which is what we have in the United States. For example, you have the national government that deals with national defense, you have the state government that deals with things like the highways, and then you also have the local government, which deals with things like county roads, also deals with education, also helps deal with things like trash removal. So if you look at a map, you can see that in the United States, there's a capital in Washington, D.C., where the national government's located. There's 50 states, and within Ohio, for example, our state capital is in Columbus, where the state house and the governor are. And then even in the counties, There's also county governments, and ours here is located in Newark, which is the county seat of Licking County. Some nations are the exact opposite of that, and they're called unitary governments, and that's where there's only one seat of power for the entire nation, and that's where the central government is located, and there's no other governments besides that one. There's also something called a confederacy, which you may remember from history class. That's what the South was during the Civil War, and it's also what our nation was when we had our first form of government called the Articles of Confederation. In a confederacy, you have multiple states or governing bodies that are almost completely independent of each other, but they do give up some power to a very weak central government, but that central government might rule over them with a few things that they all have a common vested interest in, like national defense or having a common currency or being able to trade with one another. So there is a central government, but it's very weak and has very few powers, and the governments within it are almost completely independent. Another way we can classify governments is by looking at who makes the law and their relationship to the people that enforce the law, that actually go out and make sure people follow it. In some cases, they're the same people, in which case you would call that a parliamentary system of government. In parliamentary systems of government, there's often a parliament, which is an elected body of people, and those people will make laws and vote on them. But within that group, they will select someone to be the prime minister, which is almost like the leader. And that prime minister will then select people to help him enforce the law. So not only is he a lawmaker, but he also gets to enforce the law that is made. Now, the prime minister is usually a member of the majority party in the parliament, and they get to stay in power as long as they still find favor with the majority parliament. But if they end up getting defeated on a big issue, oftentimes they'll resign. Most democracies in the world are parliamentary systems, and most of them model their parliament off of the British system, which still exists to this day. Now, parliaments can get pretty unruly sometimes. That's because there's representatives from the whole nation jam-packed into one room, and they're often debating and cheering, and it's almost like you're at a football game where one party sits on one side of the aisle, and then the opposition parties sit on the other side of the aisle, and they'll often bicker back and forth. You don't believe me? Take a look.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, dear Mr. Speaker, what a case of the...
This is intolerable behaviour as far as the public... No, it's not funny. Only in your mind, Mr. Lawton, is it funny. It's not funny at all. It's disgraceful. Mr. David Ward was in the chamber earlier today during this...
Order! 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 The honourable member must sit down if I rise to my feet. Order! He will not continue the debate from a sedentary position, otherwise he will get into real trouble.
And with innovative ways of using our hard-won credibility, which we wouldn't have if we listened to the muttering idiot sitting opposite me. If he will not, order!
Please, can we calm the debate? This is an important debate, and we don't need shouting across the chamber in that fashion. Order! Do you understand? Do you understand? Stop it. Let's take the heat out of this debate now and stop the calling.
To save banks that would otherwise have collapsed. And we not only saved the world, saved the banks and saved the banks and led the way. We not only saved the banks.
I wish the Shadow Chancellor would occasionally shut up and listen to the answer. I don't know whether... Order!
Person you saw there yelling order, that's the Speaker of the House, who often has to serve as like a referee to make sure there's order and they can actually get things done. What you saw there was actually pretty tame in Great Britain compared to what you see in other parliaments like the Ukraine.
Another day, another brawl. While Ukraine's parliament deliberated over controversial language law, deputies used their fists to let their feelings be known. One of the central figures in another recent scandal, Party of Regions deputy Vadim Kolesnichenko, says he was attacked by opposition politicians while trying to address lawmakers. Heated debates have often ignited into all-out rage inside the Rada. 2 years ago, when Parliament was due to ratify agreements with Moscow on the extended lease of Russia's Black Sea naval base, smoke bombs went off, and the Rada speaker had to hide under an umbrella from a rain of rotten eggs thrown at him. It may look like chaos and anarchy, but for some in Ukraine's political circles, it is in fact democracy in action.
Gosh, I wonder why our founding fathers didn't choose a parliamentary system. It'd be far more entertaining. But listen to what this guy says about the Ukrainian parliament and democracy as a whole.
You would never see fights in the Soviet parliament. You'll never see fights in North Korean political structures. A brawl as a last resort of delivering your point when vocal methods don't work can only happen in a democratic state. It's not effective, but still, it's democratic.
I mean, he's not wrong. You wouldn't see that type of chaos in political structures like North Korea and Russia and China. But why is that?
Well, nice of you to drop by. And what do you do?
We're your firing squad, sir.
And that brings us to dictatorships, which are notorious for stomping out any type of chaos because they don't want things to be unstable. Now, there are two types of dictatorships. There's oligarchy, which is ruled by a few, and then there's autocracy ruled by one. The way I remember this is that an automobile is driven by one person, like an autocracy is ruled by one person. And the word oligarchy reminds me of Olive Garden, and I think breadsticks, and they always come in a group. And it sounds dumb, but that's how I remember it. Now, if you've taken any history class, you know how dictatorships operate. I'm not going to go over all of that for you. Dictatorships know that freedom can sometimes bring chaos, and chaos can bring a threat to their rule and their power. There are plenty of dictatorships that exist today and are ruled by authoritarians who want total power. They're sometimes called totalitarian. Dictatorships often try to balance how cruel they are with acts of propaganda and social gimmicks to really make it look like they're a common person so that the people will love them. And as you can see, with dictatorships and democracy, ruling a nation is really a balancing act between too much freedom and perhaps a little bit of chaos and too much law and order. So way back in the 1700s, our founding fathers found themselves in a position where they got to choose the type of government not only they would live under, but also potentially future generations down the line, including ourselves. They settled on a presidential federal republic. You've already been over federal government and republic, but they didn't choose a parliamentary system. They chose a presidential system where the executive and the legislative branches are separate. The people that make the laws are also not the people that enforce the law. They had lived under the British parliamentary system, and they thought there were some problems with it. For one, laws got passed very quickly, which could be a good thing, but it could also be a bad thing if there's bad laws. There weren't very many checks and balances. Our system now has plenty of checks and balances, which we'll talk about later. So they also thought it was a bad idea that the people that make the laws were also the same people that were enforcing the laws. Imagine a police officer being able to make up laws on the spot and then enforce those laws. Might be a little dangerous. So our founding fathers thought that the person that enforces the laws should not be the same person that makes the laws. And that's essentially what a president is. A president is the chief executive, the person that executes or enforces the laws. They're in charge of the executive power of government, while our Congress in the United States, they are the lawmakers, and they're separate and independent, yet co-equal branches of government. Founding fathers felt that this struck the perfect balance between too much freedom and chaos, but also too much authoritarianism and total control. The framers were worried too little government, too much freedom would pretty much make every day like the purge. But they were also worried that creating a big, strong, powerful government with the goal of keeping everyone safe and secure would be like making the nation one big prison cell. I mean, think about it. In a prison cell, you're safe from the dangers of the outside world and not being able to find food or shelter since it's provided to you, but you have absolutely no freedom. So they tried to strike a balance, but whether or not they were successful in striking that balance is still up for debate today. It's been a question humanity's been trying to answer for a very long time. In fact, the founder of political science, Niccolo Machiavelli, was tasked with trying to give the Medici family, a political family in Florence, Italy, advice on how to keep power. And he famously said this: "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." You see, Machiavelli knew it was really hard to strike a balance of being both strong and powerful so no one would mess with you, but also coming across loving, to come across as a person of the people. Today, you see lots of different ideas on how to actually strike that balance being enacted through governments throughout the entire world. So your critical thinking question this week tasks you with trying to figure out what is the best form of government that exists today. Now, it's not going to be as simple as simply saying democracy, because freedom, man. Remember, for your Flipgrid response, or if you choose to write it, then your written response, you have to follow the rubric. And part of the rubric says that you have to counter-argue the opposing side. And there are some tough arguments against democracy. For example, is it fair that those who lose the election are subjugated to the rules of the majority? Isn't every election in a democracy minority oppression? Isn't the general population in any country too dumb to understand how things work to actually effectively govern a society? Remember, for your critical thinking response, not only do you need to pull out a resource that helps back up your position, but you also need to pull a resource from the opposition and counter it and say why that's not convincing or why it's wrong. So for your assignments this week, obviously the Ed puzzle of the video you're watching right now. Then I will also post another Ed puzzle that goes more in depth on the different types of government and the political spectrum. And then, of course, your critical thinking question for the week on Flipgrid. Or if you choose to write it, you can upload a Google Doc of your written response into that assignment page.
So for this week, both of your Ed puzzles are due on Wednesday. Your CTQ response is due by Thursday. And then I have a GIM kit for you to play and complete by Friday.
Now, if you need to contact me regarding any tech issues, or if you have any questions about your assignments, feel free to email me. You can go into the People tab in Google Classroom and find my name at the top. There's a little envelope there. You can click on that and it will automatically bring up your Gmail so you can type me an email and I will try to respond as quickly as I possibly can. Most days, though, I will probably not respond after 3:30. Usually that's when I go home around that point. So you may have to wait for a response the next day. Make sure you do not procrastinate, because if you have a tech issue and you're unable to do something and you try to email me after the fact, there's nothing I can do to help you. Even if you email me at 3:30 on Thursday and the assignment's due at midnight on Thursday night and I don't respond to you, that's on you. Use your time wisely. With all that said, I hope you have a great second week and I'll see you around the building.